On the morning of the 16th of September, 1988, the second day of the outer band impact of Hurricane Gilbert on the upper Texas Gulf Coast, the most intense Atlantic hurricane the National Hurricane Center in Coral Gables had recorded up to that date. At 73 degrees Fahrenheit, with a sustained east-southeast Gulf gale of 68 miles per hour, horizontal wind-driven rain, and a 2.5-foot storm surge standing across the salt marsh, 3 uniformed officers in heavy storm response parkas stood around a portable propane heater inside a small canvas-walled trailhead command post pitched at the west end of FM 1-985 near the small Double Bayou Bridge in Chambers County, Texas, and signed off on the record on a formal Chambers County Sheriff's Office field operations report to the Chambers County Sheriff in Anahuac that began with one short sentence and ended with another. The first sentence read, "Subject, stranded, 1979, Winnie-Stowell, ISD Bluebird type, see school bus, FM 1985, milepost 21.4, Chambers County, Texas." The last sentence read, "Recommendation. The consist cannot be reached by any equipment in the Chambers County Sheriff's Emergency Management Division inventory until the storm surge recedes." 2.5 days into the arrival of Hurricane Gilbert's outer bands on the upper Texas Gulf Coast, on a 2.5-mile stretch of marsh grass between the small Double Bayou Bridge and the stranded consist, on a 2.5-foot storm surge across the marsh flats, the Chambers County Sheriff's Emergency Management Division had been beaten by a piece of weather. 2.5 miles east of the command post, grounded on cordgrass mat with 18 inches of surge water in the aisle, and rising sat a 1979 International Harvester S-Series Bluebird All-American Type C conventional school bus in Winnie-Stowell Independent School District, red and cream factory paint, on a routine Friday morning church-organized field trip returning from the Anahuac National Wildlife Refuge with 47 civilian passengers still on board. The bus's diesel engine had stalled at 17 minutes past 6 in the morning. The driver, a 51-year-old Winnie-Stowell-based operator named Wanda Lee Harden, had, in the 98 minutes between the stall and the field report signing, kept the 47 passengers on the seatbacks above the rising surge water in near-total darkness, with the bus's small emergency dome lights on battery. The 1988 Chambers County Sheriff's Emergency Management Division field captain, a 44-year-old man named Bill Hollifield, finished signing the formal field report at 9:14 a.m. He handed the carbon to the command post radio operator for transmission to Anahuac. He walked out of the canvas command post into the wind-driven rain to call the school bus on the Chambers County SO portable VHF radio and tell Wanda Lee Harden that no help was coming across the marsh that day. What Bill Hollifield did not know, standing there in his tan Chambers County SO storm response parka, holding a VHF handset, signing off the worst field operations report of his 19-year career with the Chambers County Sheriff's Office. Was that the answer to the entire problem he had just signed off as impossible? Was, that same morning, parked under a long, weathered cypress plank pole shed beside a small cattle barn of a 71-year-old Cajun-descended Chambers County rancher and marshland guide named Beauregard "Beau" Thibodeau, on a low live oak and hackberry rise a half-mile south of the trailhead command post on the upper Thibodeau Marsh farmstead at 11 feet of elevation above the surge line, and that Beau Thibodeau drinking his second cup of chicory and coffee at the oak kitchen table of the same 1919 raised Creole farmhouse his grandfather had built with his own hands after coming across from Vermilion Parish in 1908, was already pulling on his Filson cruiser coat. To understand why a 71-year-old Cajun-descended Chambers County rancher was about to become the answer to a question the Chambers County Sheriff's Office had just spent 2.5 days failing to solve, you had to go back 40 years, to the autumn of 1948, when a 31-year-old Louisiana-born Cajun cattle and alligator line runner named Beauregard Thibodeau, Beau to everyone in the Double Bayou country, sold his small Vermilion Parish alligator line operation, drove his wife, Marie-Louise Broussard, Thibodeau, and their 2 small children, the 340 miles west across the Sabine and the Neches and the Trinity, and bought a 640-acre coastal salt marsh section at the north end of East Galveston Bay from a small Chambers County Anglo cattle family widow named Ella Mae Cade for $4,200 in coined silver, the entire cash proceeds of his 12 years of Vermilion Parish alligator line work. Beau's grandfather, Louis Alcide Thibodeau, a 63-year-old Vermilion Parish Cajun cattleman and boatman, had come across from Louisiana to Chambers County in 1908, 40 years before Beau, and had built, by his own hand, in the autumn of 1908, a raised Creole cypress plank farmhouse on a low live oak and hackberry rise at 11 feet of elevation above the marsh 3 miles east of the small Double Bayou Bridge. Louis Alcide Thibodeau had cleared the heavier live oak and hackberry on the back 40 himself with a single Percheron mule and an axe and his oldest son, and had brought the first 80 acres of the section into coastal salt marsh cattle and yellow rice cultivation by the spring of 1912. The place had passed to Louis Alcide's oldest son, Théophile Thibodeau, in 1936. Théophile had died of a stroke in the kitchen of the 1919 farmhouse in the spring of 1948, at the age of 61, 4 months before Beau bought the surrounding 640 acres from the Cade widow and moved home. Beau Thibodeau had, between the autumn of 1948 and the autumn of 1988, farmed the 640-acre coastal salt marsh section, cattle and yellow rice, for 40 straight years. He had raised his 2 children into their own married families in the same 1919 raised Creole farmhouse. His wife Marie-Louise had died of a sudden coronary event on the covered gallery of the farmhouse in the autumn of 1979. He had, in the autumn of 1961, his 13th Chambers County year, bought the 1937 Twin City FTA heavy standard tread industrial agricultural tractor, used at auction from the estate of a retired Anahuac lumberyard operator named Lloyd Hebert for $640 cash. The Twin City FTA had been Minneapolis Steel and Machinery Company's Twin City Division's last heavy industrial agricultural standard tread tractor before the 1938 merger into the Minneapolis Moline Power Implement Company. It carried a low RPM sustained torque drawbar profile that was, in Beau Thibodeau's careful judgment of the autumn of 1961, the single best piece of standard tread heavy iron ever built for the kind of work he intended to do in the Chambers County salt marsh, which was, in plain language, cattle recovery work in tidal-flooded cordgrass and voluntary unpaid marsh navigation reference for the Chambers County Volunteer Fire and Marine Rescue Station in Anahuac, for as long as he lived on the Thibodeau Marsh. He had made, across the 27 years between 1961 and 1988, 4 quiet modifications to the Twin City FTA in his own farm shop, with his own oxyacetylene torch and his own bench arc welder. He had, in the winter of 1961, custom cut and welded onto the original 1937 Twin City Heavy standard tread rear steel rims a mounting flange system to accept oversized dual-mounted 42-inch Marsh swamp tires he had salvaged that same autumn of 1960 from a used 1959 Louisiana Fair Company Marsh buggy conversion he had bought from a Vermilion Parish alligator hunter he had known since his own line-running days. He had, in the winter of 1962, hand-fitted and bolted onto the same rear steel rims a set of custom mahogany and brass wheel hub extenders that widened the rear track of the Twin City from the original 1937 factory 68 inches to 9 feet 6 inches, giving the rig the exact wide track surface stability Beau had wanted on Gulf Coast salt marsh cordgrass mat. He had, in the spring of 1966, hand-built and bolted on a canvas and canvas frame operator's canopy of his own design, lined inside with a single layer of oilskin and fitted with 2 small waterproof canvas storm curtains that dropped from the canopy frame on wing nuts for salt spray and hurricane rain protection. He had, in the autumn of 1972, after the original 1937 Twin City gasoline 4-cylinder had finally given up its main crank bearing during a Chambers County cattle recovery run, retrofitted the Twin City with a Waukesha 6-cylinder. heavy industrial diesel engine he had bought used from an Anahuac oilfield services shop, and had hand-fitted the Waukesha 6 with a custom fuel oil preheater and a hand-primed injection line for reliable cold start in high-humidity Gulf conditions. And he had, in the autumn of 1979, 6 months after Marie Louise died, bolted onto the rear deck of the Twin City a heavy steel cable spool wound with 1,200 feet of half-inch double-braid nylon marine rescue line that he had bought from the Anahuac Volunteer Fire and Marine Rescue Station at surplus prices when the station had finally replaced its 1950s-era rescue line inventory in the summer of 1979. The Twin City FTA sat that Friday morning, September 16, 1988, in the long weathered cypress plank pole shed beside the cattle barn of the Thibodaux Marsh place, under a small oilskin dust cover Beau had hand-sewn for it himself in the winter of 1973. He had been planning that previous Wednesday evening, 39 hours before the National Hurricane Center in Coral Gables had upgraded Gilbert's projected path to include the upper Texas Gulf Coast, to fire the Twin City on Friday morning, walk it the half-mile cross marsh down to the small Double Bayou Bridge, and begin, on personal initiative, the regular Friday morning cattle check and fence line pass he had been making in the same Twin City on the same 40-mile stretch of coastal salt marsh every Friday morning of every hurricane season since the spring of 1961, because Beau Thibodaux had been the unpaid volunteer Chambers County Fire and Marine Rescue Marsh Navigation reference for the coastal salt marsh section between Double Bayou and High Island, by voluntary informal agreement with the Chambers County Volunteer Fire and Marine Rescue Chief in Anahuac since 1961, and he had not missed a Friday morning marsh check pass in 27 straight hurricane seasons. Hurricane Gilbert had not, in his quiet judgment as of that Friday morning, given him any reason to start missing them. Beau Thibodaux walked the half-mile cross marsh from the Thibodaux farmstead to the trailhead command post that Friday morning in his Filson oilskin cruiser coat, his red and black Woolrich buffalo-plaid Mackinaw shirt, his knee-high rubber Louisiana marsh boots, his suspendered dark canvas work trousers, his faded olive-drab canvas, Filson tin cloth hat with the wide brim curled down against the rain, and a small olive-green canvas, vermilion Parish alligator line musette bag he had carried in his line work since 1946, slung across one shoulder. He carried inside the musette bag 3 things: a small hand-tooled, leather-covered pocket notebook of Chambers County Marsh navigation notes he had been keeping since the 2nd of November, 1961, a small waterproof Phoenix flashlight, and a single small laminated black and white photograph taken in the autumn of 1963 of his late wife Marie Louise at the steering wheel of the same 1937 Twin City FTA on the lower Thibodaux Marsh pasture in clear Chambers County autumn light. He arrived at the trailhead command post at 22 minutes past 9 in the morning. The wind was running steady at 68 miles per hour. The ambient temperature was 73 Fahrenheit. The wind-driven rain was horizontal, reducing visibility across the marsh flats below the command post to under 250 feet. Bill Hollifield, 44, the Chambers County Sheriff's Emergency Management Division field captain, had grown up in the small Chambers County town of Winnie, 13 miles east of the trailhead. He had known of Beau Thibodaux in the way that Chambers County men of his generation had known of Beau Thibodaux since he was a boy. He set down his VHF handset, came around the canvas command post desk, shook Beau's storm-mittened hand with both of his own, and asked him, without preamble, what was on his mind. Beau Thibodaux told him, quietly, in one sentence. He said he believed he could walk the Twin City FTA the 2.5 miles across the marsh to the grounded Winnie-Stowell ISD Bluebird Type C school bus, hook the bus to the Twin Cities drawbar with the 1,200-foot half-inch double-braid nylon marine rescue line spool, and walk the whole consist back to the trailhead command post at the slow, steady pulling speed of 1.25 miles per hour, weather holding worse than it currently was, inside of 5 hours total. Bill Hollifield looked at him for a long count, Then he asked Bo, very gently, whether he had heard that the Chambers County Sheriff's Emergency Management Division had spent the previous 4 hours on the same problem with 2 V-hull shallow water rescue boats, and that both V-hulls were now grounded on cordgrass mat, and that the lead field operations report he had just signed at 9:14 had formally declared the consist unreachable. Bo Thibodeau said, "Yes, Bill. I heard the field report come across your VHF 11 minutes ago. I have been monitoring the same VHF band on my own kitchen Cobra Cam 89 from the farmhouse since first light on Wednesday." Bill Hollifield thought about it for a count even longer. Then he asked Bo, "With respect, sir, what equipment do you propose to use?" Bo Thibodeau said, in his quiet Chambers County Cajun English with the vermilion parish edge still at the long vowels, "Bill, I have a 1937 Twin City FTA heavy standard tread industrial agricultural tractor with a Waukesha 6-cylinder heavy industrial diesel, a custom canvas and canvas frame operator's canopy with 2 waterproof storm curtains, oversized dual-mounted 42-inch Marsh swamp tires on custom flanged steel rims, custom mahogany and brass wheel hub extenders that give the rig a 9-foot 6-inch rear track, a hand-built electric fuel oil preheater on the Waukesha, a hand-primed injection line, and 1,200 feet of half-inch double-braid nylon marine rescue line on the rear deck spool. The Twin City will start at 58 degrees ambient in 6 minutes. It does not stall in surge water. I have run the rig on the coastal salt marsh between Double Bayou and High Island every Friday morning of every hurricane season since the spring of 1961. The Marsh tire and hub extender geometry I welded on the rig in the winter of 1962 will float the Twin City on a 2.5-foot storm surge over cordgrass mat at half throttle in a 50-mile crosswind. The consist is 2.5 miles east on FM 1985. We will be at the bus by noon. We will be back at this trailhead with the bus and 47 passengers on tow by 3:30 this afternoon. Weather worse, no exceptions. A 39-year-old Texas Department of Public Safety Hurricane Response Field Lieutenant from the Beaumont Regional Office named Lieutenant Dave Yarbrough, who had been at the command post since first light and who had spent the previous 4 hours running surge forecast calculations on the 2 grounded V-hulls, was standing at the canvas command post desk inside the tent. He laughed. He could not quite help it. He said, half under his breath, in a voice that carried in the canvas tent, "Sir, with respect, that is a 1937 tractor. The state of Texas in 1988 does not rescue Winnie-Stowell schoolchildren with antique standard tread iron." Bill Hollifield, on a good day, would have stopped him. On the morning of the 16th of September 1988, on hour 29 of standing in the worst storm of his career, Bill Hollifield did not stop him. It was a 57-year-old Chambers County Volunteer Fire and Marine Rescue senior lineman from the Anahuac Station named Ray Dupuis, who had been the lead Marine line hand on Bo Thibodeau's volunteer Friday morning marsh check crew on the coastal salt marsh every hurricane season since 1961, and who was standing at the back of the canvas tent in his own orange coveralls, who, in a quiet voice, said, "Captain Hollifield, sir, may I speak with you outside for a moment?" Bill Hollifield looked at Ray Dupuis for one long count. Ray Dupuis was a quiet man. He had not, in the 29 hours the Chambers County Sheriff's Office had been working the FM 1985 Marsh drift, asked to speak to Bill Hollifield privately, even once. Bill Hollifield put on his tan Chambers County SO parka hood. He stepped out of the canvas tent with Ray Dupuis into the wind-driven rain. They stood for the better part of 3 minutes beside the cab of one of the 2 grounded V-hulls, grounded up to the freeboard rail on cordgrass mat in the surge, in their breath, in the rain, in the 68-mile wind. Ray Dupuis told Bill Hollifield exactly 4 things, in this order. He told him, first, that Beauregard Thibodeau had been the unpaid volunteer Chambers County Fire and Marine Rescue Marsh navigation reference for the coastal salt marsh section between Double Bayou and High Island since 1961, that he had run the same 1937 Twin City FTA on The same 40-mile marsh stretch every Friday morning of every hurricane season for the previous 27 straight years, and that the Anahuac station carried his handwritten Marsh navigation notebook as an appendix to the station's own Hurricane Response Reference Manual since 1974. He told him, second, that the Twin City FTA in the long, weathered cypress plank pole shed at the Thibodaux Marsh Place was, to the best of Ray Dupuy's Chambers County Volunteer Fire and Marine Rescue Station knowledge of the matter, the only piece of mechanical equipment within 150 miles of the FM 1985 command post that had been custom configured by its own owner over 27 straight hurricane seasons for sustained low RPM diesel drawbar pulling on cordgrass mat under a 2.5-foot storm surge, and that it had run on the same Friday morning route every single Friday of every hurricane season for the last 27 straight years without one failed start and without one bogged wheel. He told him, third, that Beauregard Thibodaux was, to the best of Ray Dupuy's knowledge, the only living man on the upper Texas Gulf Coast who had personally hand-fitted a Louisiana Fair Company Marsh buggy conversion onto a 1930s standard tread industrial agricultural tractor and made it work. And that, on a morning when a Winnie-Stowell ISD school bus with 47 passengers and a 9-year-old asthmatic was about to lose the last of its emergency battery lights, the Chambers County Sheriff's Office had two clean options. They could write the consist off. The field report would land on the Chambers County Sheriff's desk in Anahuac by noon. The Beaumont Enterprise would have it by Monday morning, and Bill Hollifield's career with the Chambers County Sheriff's Office would be defined, for the rest of his working life, by the day he told a 71-year-old Cajun Marsh man that the state of Texas did not need his help. Or they could ask Mr. Thibodaux, "With respect, sir, what the Chambers County Sheriff's Office could do to assist his recovery operation." He told him, fourth and last, that the Twin City FTA had been the very first piece of equipment to walk cattle off the flooded FM 1985 marsh in the great Chambers County storm surge of Hurricane Carla in September 1961, 27 years before, and that Bill Hollifield, who had been a 15-year-old ninth grader at Winnie High School in 1961, had probably read about it in the Anahuac Progress that autumn. Ray Dupuy said in his quiet Anahuac station voice, "Captain Hollifield, with respect, sir, the field operations report is going to read poorly in 20 years if a Chambers County Sheriff's Emergency Management Division field captain in 1988 tells a 71-year-old volunteer Marsh navigation reference with a 1937 Twin City that the state of Texas does not rescue Winnie-Stowell school children with antique equipment, and then a 9-year-old asthmatic dies in the aisle of a bluebird on cordgrass on Friday afternoon. Sir." Bill Hollifield stood in the wind beside the freeboard rail of the grounded V-hull for one more long count of 5. Then he set his orange-mittened hand, briefly, on the cold gunwale of the V-hull. He walked back to the canvas tent. He stepped inside. He looked at Lieutenant Dave Yarborough and at Beau Thibodaux, standing patient and steady on the canvas floor with his storm mittens held in his right hand and his musette bag still slung across one shoulder, and he said, clearly enough for every officer inside that tent to hear, "Mr. Thibodaux, the Chambers County Sheriff's Office would be deeply obliged for your assistance. Lieutenant Yarborough will radio Beaumont at 1000 and amend the field report. Mr. Dupuis will travel with you back to your marsh place this morning and serve as marine line hand. Whatever you need from this department, sir, you will have until your tractor and the bus are back on this trailhead. Are we clear?" Beau Thibodaux said, "Yes, Captain Hollifield." He put his storm mittens back on. He shook Bill Hollifield's hand. He nodded once to Ray Dupuy. He said nothing at all to Lieutenant Yarborough. And he walked out of the canvas tent, across the wind-driven rain of the FM 1985 West Shoulder, the half-mile cross-marsh back to the Thibodaux farmstead, with Ray Dupuy walking beside him in the storm, with the warm yellow porch light of the raised Creole 1919 farmhouse visible 600 yards ahead through the rain. That's where Part 1 leaves us. A 71-year-old Cajun Marsh man walking back to his farmstead in a 68-mile-per-hour gale with a Chambers County volunteer fire and Marine Rescue senior lineman beside him, and a 1937 Twin City FTA that hasn't been fired yet, sitting under an oilskin dust cover in a cypress plank pole, shed a half-mile from a school bus with 47 people on board. In Part 2, we walk it. The rig, the marsh, the 2.5 miles across cordgrass mat under the surge, the hookup at the rear coupler of the Bluebird, the walk back with 47 passengers on tow. And what the Chambers County Sheriff's Office wrote later at the bottom of the formal field operations report Bill Hollifield had signed at 9:14 that morning. Come back for Part 2. It goes up on the channel in a few days. Subscribe so you don't miss it.